The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Order.
Order. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Okay, go for it.
Order, please. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, it is with great sadness and dismay that I speak here today. The fact I'm here to speak on the downgrading of the Minister of Fisheries to an office is hard to believe. This government is now proving to all that they care very little for Royal Nova Scotia. The men and women who rely on this industry have been beaten down and continuously misled by government. And now they have to face the reality that this vital part of Nova Scotia is being downgraded even further, leaving them with less hope for a better future. My question to the Premier, what exactly are the plans for this newly minted Office of Fisheries?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Yes. Yes, I won't take the bait, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that... Mr. Speaker, I can appreciate that the member has a very real interest in fisheries here in our province, Mr. Speaker, and I know he has spoken in this legislature many times on the topic, Mr. Speaker. I can assure you, and through you, Mr. Speaker, to all members, that the minister responsible for Nova Scotia fisheries and aquaculture is putting a great deal of time and effort into the new portfolio. For instance, Mr. Speaker, as outlined in the budget, there's a new aquaculture strategy moving forward, which should mean very good news for our province.
The honourable member for Digby Annapolis on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the fishing industry is part of our heritage in this problem. It is the one industry people think of when they hear Nova Scotia. People along the coast of our provinces has depended on this industry for hundreds of years, supplying seafood to numerous countries around the world, including our own. The trade revenues this industry used to create was unbelievable. We are currently in a downturn for this industry, and it is still one of our biggest economic generators of this province. If this government would listen to the people who run this industry, we could turn this around and make it one of the biggest in the world. My question to the Premier, why would this government ever think about downgrading this department? Are you giving up on our greatest resource and the potential it has for the future?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in fact, the opposite is true. We have given it more profile by separating the Department of Agriculture and Nova Scotia Fisheries, Mr. Speaker. This gives additional opportunity for the minister to focus on the specific issues of which are importance to the fishery here in our province, which is a tremendous contributor here to our local fishing communities, and is also a very big contributor, Mr. Speaker, to our economy as a whole. So, Mr. Speaker, in no way should this be seen as anything but an increased focus on fisheries here in our province.
The honourable member for Digby Annapolis on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it's a fact that we have a great fishing industry in Nova Scotia, but we've had little or no support from this government. Just 2 days ago, this government voted against working to rebuild it. We have the ability to once again revive this part of our heritage that makes it the great business it used to be. If this closed-minded government would just listen to some common sense from the industry. My question to the minister, will you commit to ensure that the fishing industry has a future in Nova Scotia and realize that this industry can be rebuilt and made better than it was before?
The Honourable the Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And like the member opposite says, it is one of the major industries that we have in the province. The fishing industry is the export industry is worth $1.4 billion to this province.
Good minister, too.
And we support that. We support the fishermen. We support the fish processing sector in the province, and we'll continue to do so.
honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage. Mr. Speaker, today's press release from the Minister's office highlights what is wrong with the Arts and Culture Partnership Council. Simply stated, they are too closely associated with this government. Instead of acting as an advocate for the arts and culture, they are simply acting as cheerleaders for this minister. Mr. Speaker, when will this minister get rid of her personal cheerleading section and re-establish the Arm's Length Arts Council?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague for the question. Never let it be said that I can't blow my own horn, Mr. Speaker. I don't need a cheerleading section by any stretch. Mr. Speaker, I am extremely proud of the work that the Arts and Culture Council has done. They are a phenomenal group of men and women, and they are highly qualified. And I know that the chairman and all members of that council work diligently on the behalf of all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Arts Council was legislated to advise the government through the minister on matters of arts policy. It quickly became very obvious this was not happening. The former culture minister, now the premier, ignored this Arts Council and replaced it with a body partly comprised of government bureaucrats. My question for the minister is, how can the Arts and Culture Partnership Council be considered a non-political when two of its members work for the minister?
The Honourable Minister for Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, and I thank my honourable colleague for the question. I know my honourable colleague is not questioning the integrity of anyone on that council. I would never question the integrity. I have complete faith in them, and I know that they are working hard for all Nova Scotians.
The honourable member from Dartmouth East on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the two major issues that I had brought to my attention earlier this year by members of the arts community were, number one, the need for more funds to be invested to increase our position from 9th overall in per capita funding in the arts. Number two, secondly, bring back the Arm's Length Arts Council. So the question is, when will this minister stop listening to her cheerleaders and start listening to the arts community? I heard them. Why can't you?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, number one, this government has invested 12.6% more in monies to the culture community in Nova Scotia this year. $858,000 will go to all of those Symphony Nova Scotia, to drum, to all of the worthwhile cultural activities that we have in this province. That's welcomed by all members of the arts community in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, I'll also let my honourable colleague know that we are the envy of every province in this country for our partnership council.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation. The conditions of rural roads in Nova Scotia is atrocious, and they're getting worse. Mr. Speaker, from the eastern point of Cape Breton to the western tip of the province, all roads in between, the rural infrastructure is falling apart, and people are literally breaking their cars into pieces. Mr. Speaker, within the last 3 days, there has been 4 separate petitions tabled in this House by rural residents wanting areas of the province improved. And I mentioned the eastern tip, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to table 5 pictures here of the road that's leading into Meat Cove, Mr. Speaker, to show the brutality of the road, the neglect. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Transportation is, what does he plan to do in order to repair the terrible condition of rural roads in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, since we became government in 1999, we have tripled the capital program of roads in this province. That, Mr. Speaker, That, Mr. Speaker, combined with the commitment made in the Financial Measures Act tabled today, will ensure that that level of funding, which we have exceeded, Mr. Speaker, this year, but that minimum level of funding will continue into the future, Mr. Speaker. That's what this government is prepared to do for rural roads in this province.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I haven't been here since 1999, but I've been here since 2003, and I've been hearing the same rhetoric from day one. Mr. Speaker, what I would now like, let me refresh somebody's memory here. Yesterday, a tender called, 7.6 kilometres, Tory member of Colchester North. Today, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? Today again, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to table these documents. Today again, 2.9 kilometres, the Tory Minister of Municipal Relations. Again today, Mr. Speaker, 8.2 kilometres, the Tory Minister of Tourism. Another round. Mr. Speaker, I'll table those documents because I refer. The question is where's so much for the campaign of fairness, and why do the people what I've just tendered the pictures are from Meat Cove. Mr. Speaker, I want to inform the Premier that Meat Cove is in the riding of Inverness, and they have to come to me to try to get the roads fixed. Mr. Speaker, what does the Minister intend to do with the roads in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. They don't really want to hear my answer. That's why they're making so much noise.
Order. The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, last year, we reached the level of funding for capital expenditures and roads in this province for the first time since 2002, Mr. Speaker, when it started to decline and hit rock bottom, when that group there was the government of this province, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell this House, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell all honourable members of this House, that because we have achieved the level of funding that we have, that every rural riding in this province, Mr. Speaker, will have blacktop, Mr. Speaker, to restore roads in this province.
The honourable member for Victoria Lakes on your final supplementary.
Start with Annapolis, Angus.
Order, please. The honourable member for Victoria Lakes has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I might remind the honourable minister that the former Minister of Transportation informed this House that they were $3.4 billion in debt and looking forward to going to $4.4 billion in debt by 2011. And the $34 million that was put into this year's budget sounds like a lot of money, but Mr. Speaker, at $1 million a kilometre to pave, that's 34 kilometres for the province of Nova Scotia. Try to stretch that into the Liberal ridings, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, what I want to do... Mr. Speaker, money was saved, Mr. Speaker, on the ploughing of roads this year. Because of the mild winter that we had, there was multiple millions of dollars saved.
Order.
And what did the government do with the money that was saved on ploughing? Mr. Speaker, they're replacing guardrail that doesn't need to be replaced, and they're buying $100,000 scales in order to weigh the salt every time they go out, and they already know they're going to nickel and dime and save a pound of salt here and a pound of salt there instead of putting it into asphalt. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister, when will you tell the House of Assembly that your government will commit to improving all the roads in all the rural areas across Nova Scotia, as you just promised the blacktop for all of us? I'll be back to hold you to that, Mr. Speaker. What's your answer?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member perhaps misunderstood me when he quoted the figure. When he quoted the figure of $1 million a kilometre, I said blacktop, Mr. Speaker, not gold. Mr. Speaker, I stand by the commitment I've made with respect to every rural riding in this province receiving blacktop, Mr. Speaker. And that, Mr. Speaker, is money that will be spent on roads that the honourable member is concerned about, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell the honourable member that I consider Victoria the Lakes to be part of the rural ridings of this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for Pension Benefits Act, Mr. Speaker. It has come to our attention from 4 employee representative unions, the Government Employees Union, Nurses Union, CAW, and CUPE, who recently discovered serious problems with the employer's funding of the Nova Scotia Association of Health Organizations pension fund. These unions say that the NSAHO's own members show that since 1998, healthcare employers across this province has used tens of millions of dollars of employees' pension surplus to make their own contributions to the plan, Mr. Speaker. Using these as contribution holidays, the employers spent over $25 million out of the plan surplus between 1998 and 2000. The CEO plan, or the chief of this CEO, Calvin Jordan, confirmed on April 26, 2006, that in the past 10 years, some $40 to $50 million of this planned surplus has been allocated this way. So my question to that minister is, what are you doing to investigate this?
Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member opposite for the question. I am not aware of the situation. I will have staff look into this and definitely have an answer back to that member.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is an issue that's affecting lives of pensioners that have worked hard for this province for years and years and years. And yet you see ASHO taking that money out of there, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that the past few years, the problem has only worsened. It hasn't gotten better. Since 2004, the employer has continued to make partial contribution holidays, removing between $9 and $10 million ever since per year. This money that should have been spent on much-needed improvements to those benefit packages have been flittered away. So I want to ask the minister once again, why has her and this government allowed this situation to get to the point without stepping in and protecting pensioners in our province?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, again, as I said earlier, I was not aware of the situation. I definitely will report back to this House during the next question period if that member would like to ask, or I will definitely make sure that that member is aware of the answer to that.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, she's a minister to tell me that she wasn't aware of $40 to $50 million that have been forgotten in this province while pensioners suffer, while they can't get decent and improved benefits. That's not much of an answer to say, call again, call again. Mr. Speaker, this situation has been allowed to occur is the current structure of the plan, where the plan has only 4 representatives from the trade unions, and for a total of 20. Now, I'll go a little slower because the senior members are giving her some advice. There is also a loophole allowing surpluses to be used for contribution holidays by the employer. This practice is being undertaken at the expense, as I said, of the members of this plan. Pensioners have worked darn hard for this province. So I want to ask this minister, remember Bill 68 when you think of healthcare workers. What concrete steps will you take to address this very serious problem? Because we have pensioners in this province going without. What are you going to do?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, we do have a responsibility to make sure that pensions are funded and that they're administered in this province. I had mentioned I was not aware of the situation. I will be back to that, Minister, with
Order.
an answer.
Order. Time for question period has lapsed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would you...
Order. The Honourable Government House
Very
Leader.
Excited, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would you please call resolution number 1, the estimates, Committee of the Whole on Supply, and the referral debate, and the honourable member from Halifax North, I believe was.
Honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last day, Budget Day, I had intended to stand up for only 10 or 15 minutes, and I'm told I was actually up for half an hour. So I believe that I have 30 minutes left, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to go further. I would like to go further with the theme of my remarks from the other day, which was the distance between the promises this government makes and the reality of what they actually deliver. Because we know that the distance between the promises and reality, the distance between this budget and having it passed, includes an election. No. Mr. Speaker, I heard a commentator on the radio the other day point out the very great irony in which we are in this legislature now. For what might be the first time ever in Nova Scotia history, we have a government that has tabled a budget which has no intention of passing it, and an opposition which is asking the government to stay in the House to pass their budget. Right. That's the position we're in, Mr. Speaker, because it's going to be very difficult, I think, for the government, for the Conservatives, to bridge that gap between the promise and reality, because if they really meant to do all these things, all these grand things that they've been promising in the budget and over the last days and weeks, well, Mr. Speaker, by golly, they would stay in this House and they would pass this budget, and then they could run an election on what they had accomplished instead of what they were merely promising. On Tuesday, I referred to the distance between the promise and the reality on children's pharmacare, on the basic personal exemptions and income tax, on post-secondary tuition, on long-term care beds. Members will be pleased that I'm not going to repeat myself today, but I am going to pursue the same theme on the economy, including employment, business taxes, roads, childcare, and municipalities. So let me begin, Mr. Speaker, by talking about the economy and employment. This government likes to take credit for the state of the Nova Scotia economy, but the reality, Mr. Speaker, this year, as it is every year, is in the budget documents, and that is the two most significant factors affecting the future of the Nova Scotia economy are the state of the U.S. economy and the state of the Canadian economy. Those two factors absolutely swamp any other consideration in terms of where our economy is going. And despite the government's thumping its chest over its activity, the fact is that it is the U.S. Canadian economy that determines how we are going to do, that determines how this government is going to do. And for example, Mr. Speaker, when we were briefed by the folks from Stora, we learned that the single biggest factor in the financial situation that they're facing, the biggest single adverse impact on their bottom line comes from the exchange rate. The exchange rate, because they, like so many large Nova Scotia manufacturers, are very much export-oriented. And Stora's problem, the financial difficulties, the lockout would be solved tomorrow if the exchange rate dropped from 90 cents to 80 cents. And Stora would be immensely profitable if the exchange rate dropped from 90 cents to 75 cents. It is unfortunate that the exchange rate is headed in the other direction, Mr. Speaker, and there is nothing, not one thing that this government can do about that. And that is something that they don't acknowledge, Mr. Speaker. Maybe it's part of politics, I don't know, where people take credit for things they have no business taking credit for and avoid taking blame for things for which they really ought to take some responsibility. And Mr. Speaker, as I like to do at this time every year, I'm going to now lead a pop quiz on employment in Nova Scotia, because the one of the sorriest spectacles of this government is that every month that the unemployment rate goes down, they issue a news release taking credit, and every month that the unemployment rate goes up, they don't say anything at all. So now what I would like to do is ask the members on that side of the House if they really know how employment is going in their part of the province. Let's look now, for example, Mr. Speaker, at the Annapolis Valley. Since the budget was delivered last year, for those members on that side of the House from the Annapolis Valley, has employment in your region gone up or has it gone down? And not seeing any answers, it appears that they don't know, Mr. Speaker. The answer, of course, it has gone up. But I don't expect to see that on any of the campaign literature, for example, of the member from Kings North. Since budget time last year, unemployment in that part of the province has gone up. Now, Mr. Speaker, in Cape Breton, has unemployment gone up or down since budget time last year? Anybody? Oh, I'm sorry, they don't have any members from Cape Breton. Well, not from industrial Cape Breton at any rate. As a matter of fact, it's gone down. Good for them, but it's now down to 15.0%, which really, by any measure, is awful. It's really a disgrace to us here in this House that we tolerate a region of our province having an unemployment rate that high, 15.0%. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm again going to refer to what in previous years I've called the dirty little secret of Cape Breton unemployment, and that is the participation rate. The participation rate is the measure of what percentage of the adult population in Cape Breton is either working or looking for work. In other words, to look at it the other way, how many people have Cape Breton have even given up, even looking for work? And the participation rate in Cape Breton continues to be abysmal, among the lowest in the entire country at 51.9%. And what that means, Mr. Speaker, is that approximately half of the adult population on Cape Breton Island have given up even looking for work. And so the real unemployment rate is very much higher than the 15% that I referred to earlier. On the North Shore, Mr. Speaker, your own home territory, I wonder if you know, Mr. Speaker, whether unemployment's gone up or down since the last budget. And there I have my first correct answer of the day. It's gone down. And good for you, member. If we had more members like you, I'm sure we'd see even better results. What about the southern region? What about the southern region? Anybody know? That would include the member, the territory of the member for Queens. Mr. Bean, I wonder if the member for Queens knows whether unemployment in his area has gone up or down since the last budget. The answer, of course, the correct answer is it has gone up. I doubt very much, though, that he's going to print that on his campaign literature. So, Mr. Speaker, this government likes to brag about the state of employment in Nova Scotia, but there are a few simple facts that they never like to mention, and that is that employment across Canada is at 30-year record levels. And the rate of growth of Nova Scotia employment actually lags the country. And they like to say, well, there's more people working than ever before. And that's true because of that factor that I referred to earlier. It's not because of anything that these folks have done over on that side of the House. It's because the Canadian economy is going well. And it's right there in the budget documents in black and white, like it is every year, which is the single biggest factor on how many of us are working, how many taxes we're paying, how much taxes we're paying, is the state of the Canadian and American economies. And it so happens that at the moment the Canadian economy is doing rather well. But one of the dark clouds on the horizon is the rising exchange rate, which is very much going to hurt the export-oriented industries of Nova Scotia, like Stora, Mr. Speaker, like Michelin, like our fish harvesters and fish processors, because Nova Scotia is a very outward-looking province. Its economy is open to the world. And there's not one thing that they can do about Canada's exchange rate, nor is there anything that we can do, and yet that absolutely dwarfs any other efforts that the government can make on the economy. Let's talk then about the distance between the promise and the reality on business taxes. I had the opportunity just yesterday to look at an analysis of the budget done by a business analyst here in town, and his analysis was quite different from what you would get from the government if you believe the government. He called the cuts in personal income taxes, quote, minor. And they are minor, Mr. Speaker, because the government would like people to believe that there's a significant income tax cut, but of course it's not true. It's pennies on the paycheck. And not this year. It's not even going to kick in until next year. People will notice literally pennies on their paycheck as a result of these so-called income tax cuts. The analyst went on to point out that almost all of the cuts to business taxes had been previously announced. They were measures that were included in last year's budget, and all that the government did this year was re-announce, that's the word that the analyst used, re-announce the measures that were in last year's budget. And in fact, something that I didn't hear anybody on the government side refer to is that there's one business tax that's actually going up, and that's the large corporations capital tax. Now, the government wants to draw attention to the fact that they're lowering the rate by a tiny amount, but what they didn't state and what wasn't addressed in any of the budget documents was that this tax, which was scheduled to be phased out in 2009, has been extended to 2012. So although these large corporations are going to be paying slightly less each year, they have to pay the total amount for 3 more years, which means that the total that they're going to be paying extra far exceeds any amount that they're going to save. And so this business analyst, Mr. Speaker, was quite indifferent to this taxing. It's really not anything much one way or the other. It's, again, the promise being so much greater than the reality. And then we turn to this issue of roads, this vexed issue of roads. And now, I know, Mr. Speaker, in case I ever forget, I always know I'm in Nova Scotia when I hear the Minister of Transportation stand up days before an election saying every rural constituency in Nova Scotia will see new blacktop. Yeah, Mr. Speaker, it's got to be Nova Scotia when a minister stands up and says something like that. And yet in my own riding, Mr. Speaker, he won't even promise to fix the most dangerous intersection in all of Western HRM. He sends me vague, non-committal letters saying, well, maybe we will, maybe we won't. We're studying it. Depends on other priorities, Mr. Speaker. I would have thought before the minister promises to pave his government's way to re-election that they might commit to fixing the most dangerous intersection in all of Western HRM. And who is it that says that it's the most dangerous intersection of all HRM? It is Department of Transportation staff, Mr. Speaker. They said it. I didn't say it. I'm simply repeating what they said to me. And yet the minister can't see his way to finding a few dollars to fix that. And then there's the question, Mr. Speaker, which was raised in the Public Accounts Committee a couple of months ago, in that the promise that they make doesn't even match reality, because their promises of spending all the motor fuel money and registry of motor vehicle net revenue on roads simply isn't true when you look at the numbers. What they're doing, among other things, is mixing apples and oranges. They're mixing operating spending and capital spending, which in accounting terms should never get added together. And the other thing they're doing, of course, is that they're putting in a lot of what you might call administrative money, so that when they flick on the light switch in the headquarters here in downtown Halifax, that counts as spending on roads, Mr. Speaker. So they take every possible thing that they could think of, including administrative costs, right here in the downtown center of Halifax, and then they say, look at all the money they're spending on roads. But that includes the light bill for a downtown Halifax office building. And if you go to the people in the rural areas with the potholes in the road, and they say, well, is that good enough? Does that, in your view, does that count as spending on roads? I'm pretty sure that I know what the answer would be, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government House Leader says it's NDP accounting. That's not my accounting. That's the way this government, the Conservatives, are doing it. That's the way they're doing it now. Again, Mr. Speaker, the promise being so very, very far short of the reality.
The Honourable Government House Leader on a point of order. The Honourable Member is commenting on the fact that we use the lights in the Department of Transportation to do our work. At least we don't live in the dark, and I was wondering if he would concede that that is correct.
That is not a point of order, but the member for Halifax Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, whenever I hear point of order in this House, I know it's not likely to be a point of order. What I will concede, Mr. Speaker, is that the government grossly exaggerates the amount it spends on roads and continues to grossly exaggerate the amount that it spends on roads for electoral purposes. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me turn then to the distance between the promise and reality on municipalities. Now, I was very hopeful when I opened the budget book, and there's a whole page headed Investing in Municipalities. And you think, great, at least municipalities got one page out of the, 28-page budget document. The problem is that it's only the first paragraph that's actually about municipalities. The rest of the page is about other things. So again, Mr. Speaker, this illustrates better than anything else the problem that we have here. Big headline, investing in municipalities, but then you find out that 3/4 or more of the page is about something else. That what they're actually doing for municipalities is really very small. And you don't need to believe me, Mr. Speaker. I would like to quote a great friend of the government, the Mayor of Halifax, Peter Kelly, whose response, I believe that he was even thinking at one time of running for the Conservative Party leadership. So we know that he's a friend of the government, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, what was Peter Kelly's response to the budget? What did he say? 2 words, Mr. Speaker: dog's breakfast. Did you read that in the paper? I did. Peter Kelly said it was a dog's breakfast. And do you know why he called it a dog's breakfast, Mr. Speaker?
Point of order, the Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And for the information of the floor, the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities are meeting as we speak in Digby, and they unanimously support the budget of this government that was tabled, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Again, that's not a point of order, but taken under consideration. The member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me explain why Peter Kelly called the budget a dog's breakfast. He said it was a mishmash. There were some things that were giving small amounts to the municipality, other things that were taking away. He had to set his staff to work to figure out whether at the end of the day the Halifax Regional Municipality was ahead or behind. And I suspect that all of the other municipalities in Nova Scotia have to do the same thing. Now, there were some big promises from that minister just before the budget that there would be stuff in here that they would like, and yet the mayor of the largest municipality in Nova Scotia, after seeing the document, called it a dog's breakfast, Mr. Speaker. And now, the UNSM, as we all know, has issued a discussion paper on what they call fair and equitable funding. They believe that the province should share more of its revenues with the municipalities in order to permit the municipalities to discharge their functions at a reasonably comparable level of taxation. And there is not one word in this budget addressing that. There is no money allocated to address that, Mr. Speaker. Because, let me give you another example. The mandatory education levy, the percentage has been reduced, which the government shouts from the rooftops. But what they don't say is that because of skyrocketing property assessments in Nova Scotia, that actually means the province is still taking in more money from the municipalities. And as we all know, this mandatory levy is very much a sore point within municipalities. So the government shouts, look, we're reducing the rate, but with the other hand, they take in more revenue because of skyrocketing assessments. That, Mr. Speaker, is typical of this government and this budget. On childcare, now that the federal government has thoroughly messed up the childcare system in Canada, Mr. Speaker, this government rides in with a plan. They say they have a plan on childcare, but it's a 10-year plan, Mr. Speaker. It's a 10-year plan. And all of the money, all of the new money that they're going to be spending on childcare this year and next year is federal money. So they're going to take the money The 2 years that the federal government committed to before they ripped up the agreement, the 2 years, and they're going to take that money and say, look at us, aren't we good? Aren't we good on child care? And after that, they and their federal cousins really don't know what they're going to do, because really the federal plan doesn't deserve to be called a child care benefit. It's not a child care benefit, it's an income support benefit. It's whatever you call it, Mr. Speaker, but it's not money directed at child care. It's a very clever, very, very politically clever move to do something and call it something else, something that these conservatives know how to do very well. Mr. Speaker, they call it a child care benefit, but it really, at the end of the day, has nothing to do with child care at all. Nothing at all. Once again, Mr. Speaker, the promise falling very far short of the reality. That is and must be the theme of this budget. But still, there is something that we can support in this budget, something we like very much. And I talked about that the other day. And that is that the government finally is taking the provincial portion of the HST off home heating sources. After years of saying that it was impossible, that it could not be done, it was too expensive, we'd have to consult with the other provinces, we'd have to consult with the federal government. The member for Pictou Centre said on many occasions could not be done. The former finance minister said on even more occasions, could not be done, absolutely impossible. And here we are, Mr. Speaker, probably 2 days before an election call, maybe one, but probably two. The government says, oh yes, it can be done. So now we know it was always possible. It is possible and always was. We know that it can be done and always could. Why did it take the government so long to discover that it could be done? Well, because there's an election coming, Mr. Speaker. Because they know it was popular. They know it was the right thing to do. And as my leader has said before, I'm about to use an unparliamentary word, so I better not, Mr. Speaker. I was going to say, to use the phrase, you don't have to steal our ideas, but I'm not allowed to say steal. So what I will say, although my name is Steele, which is an irony, Mr. Speaker, they don't have to take our ideas without notice or compensation. They can have them for free. There's lots more where those ideas came from, Mr. Speaker. We are the party of ideas. We're the party of accomplishing things for people. But even this, Mr. Speaker, this good thing, they couldn't even get that right, because at the same time that they're making an election-based promise to remove the HST from home heating sources, something that they said up until very recently, the Premier said impossible, can't be done, too expensive, I don't support it. Now they say it's going to be done, but they can't even do that right. There is no reason why at the same time they had to eliminate the Keep the Heat program, which was the income-based program for fuel support for home heating sources. Why did they have to do that? They didn't have to. Well, the suggestion has been made by my good friend, the member for Richmond, that they do it because they're Tories. Sometimes they just can't help themselves, Mr. Speaker. It's in their nature. They didn't have to do it because that is the money that supported the poorest among us, the people with the lowest incomes, many people in their own ridings. Because, of course, many people in my riding don't qualify for it, because if you're going to own your own home in Fairview, chances are your income is too high for the cutoff. But many people in the rural areas of the province with very low income still own their own home. But guess what? After this give with one hand, take with the other, many of those people are going to end up worse off. They're going to end up getting less money than they did before. But I doubt very much that that is going to be underlined and emphasized on their campaign literature. So, Mr. Speaker, here we are. We have a budget which the government does not want to pass. We have an opposition that is calling on the government to go through the budget debate, bring this budget to the vote. We are willing to accept the deficiencies of the budget in order to achieve the positive things that are in the budget, noting in particular removing the HST from home heating sources. But it appears that the government is not willing to bring their budget to the vote. How can they go to the voters and convince those voters that they actually intend to follow through on these big promises, many of which they have borrowed from our party? If they really meant to do it, they would stay in this House and they would keep working and they would pass this budget. And Mr. Speaker, I think it will be all the evidence that Nova Scotians need about their intentions of actually following through on this stuff if they call an election this weekend, Mr. Speaker, or next week before the budget comes to a vote. That will tell Nova Scotians everything they need to know about this government's intentions. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we know our job. Our job is to get a better deal for today's families. We did that yesterday. We do it today. We will do it tomorrow. We will do it through an election campaign if necessary, Mr. Speaker. We know that is our job, and we know that Nova Scotians know that the best way to get a better deal for themselves and their families is to send more New Democrats to this House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, honourable member. I'll now recognize the Liberal leader in the House.
Mr. Speaker, it's I'm not sure if I'd say a pleasure, but I guess it's my opportunity to rise and to be able to say a few words on the budget. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, it's the other day when a bill was introduced in Justice, certainly no reflection on the minister, but, you know, when I was given my opportunity on second reading, it was almost, what's the use? You know, why get up and, you know, wax eloquence about a bill that you know is going nowheres, at least not in this session. For sure. So I almost have the same feeling about this budget. And should I spend an hour talking about a budget and our concerns knowing it's not going anywhere? Knowing that we have to rely upon the government and the Minister of Finance who stands in his place and says, yes, yes, believe me, I promise this budget will go through eventually. Well, Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure I'll mention on a few occasions in my remarks, Nova Scotians, as I've said before, remember the last time Tories came bearing gifts come election time. Promises of tax cuts only to disappear after the election. So, Mr. Speaker, let me, with those few opening comments, let me go through my remarks. First of all, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians and all members of this House realize that this budget is in fact nothing more than the campaign platform for the Conservative Party, paid for by the taxpayers of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the former Minister of Finance, Mayor from Bedford, says, well done. Well, I'm not sure if he means well done that the Tories use taxpayers' money to put their campaign platform together, or maybe he has something else that he feels well done. But allow me to say, Mr. Speaker, and it's my understanding that some members of the House will not be given an opportunity to speak, but I do wish the former Minister of Finance and member from Bedford well in his future, and certainly commend him for the time he spent here. He has a long history in Bedford, and I do wish him well, and you know, Mr. Speaker, I would never want to put myself in the position of telling the House Leader for the government of what to do, but if we are to meet tomorrow, I would hope that there'd be an opportunity while we meet for those members who may not be returning after the next election, at least those who know they're not returning. Many of us are hoping we will, but there may be surprises. But I do hope there will be a few moments given to each of those members to bid their farewell here in this House, and either whether it be the member from Bedford or the member from Shelburne or some of the other members who will not be coming back. So I leave that with the government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned before, Nova Scotians remember well the last election when tax cuts were promised. One party, and one party only, stood in the House before and during the campaign and said, we cannot afford this tax cut. Our finances are nowhere near being in a situation where we can afford this tax cut. Not that tax cuts are bad, but it's just not the time. And unfortunately, while we've been able to work with the NDP on some issues together to keep the government accountable, on that issue they decided that politically it didn't make sense for them to oppose that tax cut. So the leader at the time said it'd be political suicide to oppose a tax cut, so he remained silent. So how many Nova Scotia families and how much impact did that have on our finances? Well, it managed to put the government back in power, in minority situation, but it's unfortunate that the leader of the NDP had not joined us, and together we could have campaigned and telling Nova Scotians the province couldn't afford a tax cut. And unfortunately, at the end, not that I want to say I told you so, but yeah, really, I told you so, and it was true. The province had to rescind it. Unfortunately, the Premier had to swallow his own commitments and rescind, for the most part, the majority of that tax cut. Mr. Speaker, as we know, if an election is called within the next few days or the next few hours, this budget dies. The question becomes then, Nova Scotians have to ask, if we re-elect a Conservative government, will they bring in the same budget? Or will they suddenly say, like the last election, well, the tax cut, on the home heating oil, well, we can't really take that off. Or increasing the basic personal exemption, well, we gave ourselves till 2007, so we have lots of time. Maybe we can't afford that. Or how many other of the measures in here will the government suddenly say, upon reflection, we don't have the money that we thought we did? Mr. Speaker, it is our belief that the budget presented last week, was it last week or was it this week? This week, is unsustainable. Mr. Speaker, the government talks about 10-year plans for roads, continuing care, and child care, but it's doubtful that this budget will even hold up its commitments for 1 year. Mr. Speaker, this budget relies much too heavily on projected offshore revenues of $288 million. Yesterday, Export Development Canada said that the energy sector exports in Nova Scotia will actually decline by 5%, and yet the government continues to have the bulk of their budget relying upon offshore revenues. Mr. Speaker, budgets are all about priorities. This government says it will remove the provincial sales tax from oil at a cost of $75 million a year to the provincial treasury. That means the average user of oil will save 54 cents a day. Mr. Speaker, not even enough for a cup of coffee. But what's even more startling, Mr. Speaker, and it was even startling for me, is that Nova Scotians, 60% of residents of Nova Scotia, continue to burn oil for their heat. Mr. Speaker, the national average is 12.5%. Mr. Speaker, we need to address the fact that we are still overly dependent on fossil fuels in this province. And yet, by giving a cut on oil, what message does that send? Does that send a message of conservation? Does that send a message of trying to look towards green energy, of trying to change our ways? Not at all. It sends a message of consume more because you'll have more money to consume. Rather than put the heat on 20, put it up to 23 or 25 because you're going to get savings. We need to have a means, Mr. Speaker, of being able to work with Nova Scotians towards making their homes more energy efficient, making their homes less dependent on oil, and making our province as a whole less dependent on fossil fuels. Mr. Speaker, we also have the highest tuition in the country, which is clearly driving our young people away. While Nova Scotians, for the most part, stayed in this province to study, now they're looking at Newfoundland and looking at New Brunswick and looking at other jurisdictions, saying it makes more sense for me economically to go to those provinces than stay here in Nova Scotia. Not because they don't like Dal, not because they wouldn't like to go to St. FX or Acadia or Mount St. Vincent or St. Mary's or Université Saint-Anne or Cape Breton University. They just can't afford it. And they're looking down the road and saying, can I handle the debt load at the end of the day? You know, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, and I've said this many times in the House, when I graduated from university after 6 years at Dalhousie University, the BA and then my law degree, 6 years, owing $35,000. Mr. Speaker, back in my riding, that would almost buy you a home. It would buy you a small bungalow, and it would certainly go a long ways towards a mortgage payment. But what did I have to show? Well, I had my degree, and I owed $35,000. Mr. Speaker, when you talk to students today, that was in 1997, only 9 years ago. They're now saying today, that's a small amount. Imagine what it is today for students graduating. Mr. Speaker, average undergraduate tuition fees at Nova Scotia universities are the highest in Canada at $6,281 per year. A recent study has concluded that post-secondary education in Nova Scotia is the least affordable of all provinces and states in North America. So what a distinction. Come to life in Nova Scotia, come to the most expensive universities in all of North America. Well, isn't that something to be proud of? And somehow I didn't see where the government added that into their campaign for tourism and their campaign for life. Mr. Speaker, the NDP and the governments indicate that their priority is the removal of the 8% provincial portion of the HST off of home heating oil. Mr. Speaker, let's look at that promise. It sounds nice when you say it quickly, but for example, Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has stated, quote, removing the HST from home heating fuel will not ensure protection either. If the fuel prices increase beyond the HST, the 8% provincial tax component of the total fuel prices, low-income consumers would have to make up the difference. Removing the HST could also provide an unnecessary windfall to owners of large homes with high energy costs and who are not significantly impacted by high energy prices. Mr. Speaker, that's what was stated on that. Mr. Speaker, there's also the concern that landlords now may be able to benefit from this reduction, and the question is, will that benefit be passed on by lower rent costs to the tenants? I highly doubt that. Mr. Speaker, it's ironic that when we, as a Liberal caucus, presented our gasoline plan that would actually save Nova Scotians money on gas prices, the criticism was that if you reduce 2 cents off the motor fuel tax, the oil companies will eat it up, and there'll be no savings at the end of the day. Mr. Speaker, if that's the argument that the government and the NDP wish to use against our plan, how does that argument not work against their own plan? That if you take 8% provincial tax off of home heating oil, the companies will raise their price by 8%. So who gets the saving? So you can't argue it against our plan, but not accept it as an argument against other plans being put forward of a similar nature. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned to you, the 8% the decision by the government, the last-minute conversion to take the 8% provincial tax off of home heating oil, we all know, is basically meant to steal a plank from the NDP platform. Between that and gas regulation, they've almost made the NDP irrelevant. But, you know, Mr. Speaker, in that regard, you know, the finance critic says they're still hanging on to public auto. You know, and we saw from their last convention, they're still looking at bringing back Nova Scotia Power into public hands. So it's good to see that they're still keeping up with modern issues facing Nova Scotians. But, Mr. Speaker, one of the concerns looking at this plan, for example, is that if the Customs and Revenue Canada do not agree to a point-of-sale rebate, then guess what will happen? The government will basically have to reinstate the Provincial Tax Commission and cause red tape. Yes, more red tape for small independent fuel delivery operations. Mr. Speaker, how ironic that the government in their throne speech indicated that they wanted to create a new red tape task force to make up for what the first red tape task force failed to do, and yet they're still talking about more regulation, not only through this HST, the provincial tax on oil, but also through gas regulation. Mr. Speaker, we know that gas regulation in this province will cause more red tape. Mr. Speaker, not a mention of regulation in the budget. Not $1 set aside for gas regulation, which we begged us to ask the question to finance officials, why would there not be any money set aside for regulation? There's going to be a cost to administer this. You know what the response was? Industry will pick up the cost. Well, if industry picks up this added cost, how is industry going to get that cost back? Well, Mr. Speaker, that's you and I and the rest of Nova Scotians. And what does that mean? Higher gas prices. That's what it means. The government has admitted regulation brings higher prices. There'll be no savings. So why are we considering regulation? Well, it's another way of stealing a plank from the NDP. It's another means to try to convince Nova Scotians that this is something that's good for them on the eve of an election. Here is the Premier who sat as a cabinet minister last fall when under former Premier Ham, they came out after the Gardner-Pinfold study and said regulation is bad for Nova Scotia. The member from Cumberland North at that time said that regulation was bad. Last week, he said regulation was good. Which one is it? I would submit to you, whatever the Tories have to do or say to win an election, they are prepared to do. Which is why today, Mr. Speaker, when during question period, I asked the Premier, why did he take a chapter out of the book of former Premier John Buchanan rather than take a page out of the book of the former Premier of Nova Scotia, the MLA for Pictou Centre? Because something's wrong here. Someone is not giving us the full picture. Now, it's either the former Premier was somehow not really telling us the true state of our finances, or the current one somehow is giving us a picture that may not be true. But which one is it? That's what Nova Scotians are left. Many columnists have concluded that the current government, the current Premier, is basically going to run on a campaign saying the former Premier was the mean old Premier, but I'm the good Premier. So everything he was mean about, I'm going to be good. I think that's a shame for the former Premier of this province to see that his own colleagues, people who sat in his cabinet, are now using his own legacy for their political advantage. Not by promoting his legacy, but pretty much saying that he was wrong and that they somehow are a better government. Mr. Speaker, history will judge them on that sort of approach. Mr. Speaker, budgets boil down to choices. Healthcare spending is up another 7% this year and is on track, I'm sad to say, to meet the former Premier's own predictions that it will consume the entire revenues of the province by the year 2020. Mr. Speaker, only one party in this House has talked about the crisis in healthcare. Only one party has called upon the government to have a debate and to look at means that we can sustain our healthcare system and be able to afford it for the future. Because right now, our province is growing and our economy is growing by 2 to 3%. Healthcare this year, 7%. Last year, 9%. And the year before that, 11%. And it's not going to get any better, Mr. Speaker. This year, the government has decided to put another $200 million into healthcare. Mr. Speaker, in 1999, the Premier told us healthcare doesn't need more money, it needs better management. Well, that sounds great. That was a wonderful statement at the time. No more money, but better management, fine. So let's see how you're going to do better management and you're going to be able to keep the costs where they're at. Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate because while I have great respect for the former Premier, I believe his greatest failure has been in healthcare because $1.4 billion is what they have put into healthcare. Has it made our healthcare system better? Well, you can go ask the people who are in hospitals right now waiting for placement in long-term care, or people who are waiting for surgery on long lists. They thought that the former Premier was being serious when he told them healthcare can be fixed not with more money, but with better management. $1.4 billion later. Who's going to pay for this? How can it be affordable? And the Premier's the one who gave us a report that said, at current levels of spending, healthcare will consume the entire provincial budget by the year 2020. Who, Mr. Speaker, is going to be able to get control of this? Or are we just going to wait till 2020, scratch our heads and say, hey, we don't have money for anything else now. Healthcare is the only one department of government. All other departments are gone. We have asked for a debate on that issue. We are the only party who's raised it. The NDP refuses to even talk about it. Again, like the tax cut, they feel that it's politically dangerous for them to raise that issue, and that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because, Mr. Speaker, we're sitting here. 2020 is not far away. And every time the health budget increases, that date is getting closer. I'll submit to you it's no longer 2020. It's on its way to get there much quicker. Mr. Speaker, the government is putting more money into health, and all they talk about is fuel oil and produce nonsensical continuing care documents that project out 10 years instead of dealing with the problems facing health care now and the need for beds now. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that the party that rode healthcare to victory in 1999 is not even mentioning it today. $40 million. gets little to no mention. Why? Because they know it's in a crisis and they don't know how to deal with it, and more importantly, they don't want to talk about it. You know what, Mr. Speaker? It almost reminds me of the situation at Stora. Something they don't know how to deal with, and so they choose not to talk about it. Very similar, Mr. Speaker. Time will tell during the campaign trail as to what impact this government's inaction on dealing with the issues at Stora or Shawwood Industries is going to have on them. Mr. Speaker, we do believe for Nova Scotians that it is time for a change. Nova Scotians have seen 6 years, almost 7 years now of Tory rule. They've seen that our debt is increasing, our health care hasn't been addressed, education, universities, childcare. Mr. Speaker, we do believe it is time for a change, and we believe that our party will be able to put that change forward for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, students across this province are bewildered by the absolute dismissal of university students and their challenges. Mr. Speaker, our party and our caucus's priority is education, health care, and a province where people can stay, live, and work, and more importantly, raise a family. Mr. Speaker, the NDP and the Tories agree. The provincial portion of the HST off of oil is their priority. University is not. In fact, Mr. Speaker, what did the leader of the NDP say before the budget was tabled? At the NDP convention 2 weeks ago, the leader of the NDP said, quote, "If a government of any stripe is going to actually take the HST off of home eating, this party, the Nova Scotia NDP, will happily vote in favor," end quote. Mr. Speaker, we all know the HST is not being taken off of home eating oil. The provincial portion of the HST is, but there's still the 7% tax that will still remain on that. Mr. Speaker, the leader of the NDP didn't say that he'd support a budget if they lower tuition or freeze tuition. He didn't say that he'd vote for a budget if it addressed the need for long-term care beds. He didn't say that they would vote for a budget if it ended up getting better math scores here in Nova Scotia. HST was it. Leading this province, Mr. Speaker, requires more than one issue at a time. It's about priorities. The newly formed Conservative NDP alliance has clearly stated their priorities, and they do not include lower tuition or new long-term care beds in the near future for our seniors and our families who need them right away. Mr. Speaker, this government is putting up to $75 million in revenue aside in order to try to buy its way to an election, or are they really going to be setting it aside? One can only tell after the election. Mr. Speaker, what makes this all the more cynical is that we know this budget will never see a debate, nor will ever be voted upon. As I said, Mr. Speaker, we believe it's time for a change. We fully expect an election call soon, and at least Nova Scotia will still have one choice. Mr. Speaker, it's a choice between the Liberal Party and the rest. Mr. Speaker, a vote for the NDP or the Tories means higher gasoline prices, higher education costs, and continual healthcare crisis. Mr. Speaker, what we have here is a series of 4 to 10-year plans with no substance, just like we saw in the continuing care plan for yesterday. And Mr. Speaker, allow me to say, I sat here in 1998, I sat here in 1999 on that side of the House as a member of government and later as a minister. And I remember where I stand here today, the Conservative caucus sat. And I remember the Minister of Justice. I remember the Minister of Education. And I remember other members who were continually attacking the government for the need for more long-term care beds. Repeatedly, day in, day out. That was the message. More long-term care beds, and how they would provide more long-term care beds. And how ironic that after 7 years of Tory rule, we have less long-term care beds here in this province. How did that happen? But then again, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about beds. I remember the former member from Halifax Citadel in her famous campaign in 1999 with her postcard. Close Cisco, open more hospital beds. I remember the day in estimates when I had the opportunity for 1 hour. I had to put the question to her 15 times. You closed Cisco, how many more hospital beds did you open? she wouldn't answer. I remember at one point the Minister of Education stood up to try to defend her. The current Minister of Transportation stood up to try to defend her. You know, at the end of the day, I remember Jean Laroche with CBC Radios came with the figures showing, well, wait a minute, since they closed Cisco and since they've been elected, there's actually less hospital beds here in this province. She didn't open one, she closed them. More Tory hypocrisy, Mr. Speaker, is what you saw right there. And where is she today, Mr. Speaker? The people of Halifax Citadel and the people of Nova Scotia repaid that particular member for that cynical promise she made, and they sent her a postcard. It was thanks, but no thanks, when she came back for a re-election. Mr. Speaker, we look, for example, at some of the plans. They want to eliminate the corporate capital tax by 2012. 6 more long years before that tax is gone. Mr. Speaker, we have a 10-year daycare plan when Nova Scotians need daycare now. And Mr. Speaker, let me remind you again that the federal Liberal government's plan would have actually allowed the province to double the amount of spaces that they announced just last week. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned before, this budget does absolutely nothing to address the long-term crisis in the funding of healthcare in this province. I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that minority government in its current state is broken, and it does not function because we have a Conservative government that believes they have a majority and has been acting as if they have a majority. No longer do they speak to the leader of the official opposition. No longer do they speak to the members of our caucus or to our leader. They have chosen to go ahead with their own plan. That is not what Nova Scotians voted for. Mr. Speaker, the high Canadian dollar is killing our export sector. This government is relying on a $288 million infusion from Sable to get us through this year. Mr. Speaker, I submit to you that that is a gamble. The Export Development Corporation says the value of our offshore exports will decline by 5% next year. And the question, Mr. Speaker, we need to ask is how much longer will Sable be producing gas in our province? We hear different figures, Mr. Speaker, and I'd love to tell you those figures are promising. They are not. Those reserves are depleting. We're now hearing 3 to 5 years. Mr. Speaker, that's not a long period of time. But this government is increasing its yearly spending on the basis the offshore will be there each year to bail them out. Mr. Speaker, I would submit to you that is not long-term care planning. And the question is, when will government have to start clawing back because they've started to overspend? Mr. Speaker, the Premier is trying to tell Nova Scotians that you can have tax cuts and get the same level of service because the offshore money will make up for the shortfall. Mr. Speaker, if the offshore is the only thing that is propping up this budget, I would submit to you we are in big trouble in this province. Mr. Speaker, in fact, this budget is disjointed and dangerous, and it tries to be all things to all people. I would submit to you it is not sustainable. Mr. Speaker, I submit to you it is not possible. We have a $12.4 billion debt that arrived after a government a long time ago thought they could rely on offshore revenues or economic growth. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't work that way, and Nova Scotians know this. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned today, it is just incredible that we would have a government announce a budget with $500 million in additional spending and yet turn around and increase the debt of this province. Mr. Speaker, this is the government, again, that the former Premier in 1999's famous words, I will not increase the debt of this province. We will live within our means. I will not burden my grandchildren with the decisions we make today. We all remember those famous words. The Minister of Finance, former Minister of Finance remembers those words. Each year, the debt has continued to increase. $12.4 billion is the noose we have around our neck and is the one biggest thing stopping this province from moving forward. When we're still spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year to service that debt, and then the government could say $500 million more in spending, $500 million more in spending, and they're going to increase the debt. You know, Mr. Speaker, I'd respond to the clucking from the member from Yarmouth, but it'd be of no use, Mr. Speaker. And see, now I get to hear his childish. Now I get to
order,
hear.
Please. Order. The member for Richmond has the floor. I'll recognize the member from Richmond.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Now the member from Yarmouth will charm us with his childish comments and childish names, and maybe the government House leader could warm up his milk and get him his pacifier, and then he could be maybe quiet again for a few days, or. I won't speak, Mr. Speaker, I won't speak too long because I wouldn't want him to yawn out loud again in this House, as he is so notorious for doing, so I don't want to bore him too long with trying to speak on behalf of Nova Scotians. So I will try to keep my remarks a little bit shorter, Mr. Speaker, as not to trouble the member from Yarmouth too much. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, this budget, Mr. Speaker, well, when you hear the member from Yarmouth say talking about health care, education, tuition, and child care is not important, Mr. Speaker, I think it speaks more of his personal character than anything else, Mr. Speaker, and maybe the people from Yarmouth will open their eyes and see truly what they have sent us here in Halifax. Once again, Mr. Speaker, we can stand here and listen to the childish little cat calls over there from the clucking of the Minister of Yarmouth.
Order, please. I'll ask the member to allow the other member to carry on with his speech, and I'll again recognize the member from Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, and that's Minister of the Crown. That's always interesting to hear. So, Speaker, as I mentioned, we believe this budget has not addressed the needs of the people of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we believe that the only alternative at this point is the plan that we will be putting forward as a party. Mr. Speaker, we can't continue to underfund education and expect to keep our young people here to grow the economy and at the same time expect to pay the skyrocketing costs of our healthcare system. Mr. Speaker, you can't just throw money at the healthcare system and expect it to get better and hope it goes away. Mr. Speaker, the government doesn't talk much about health nowadays because they simply don't want to face the colossal challenge before them and would rather push it off to leave for another administration to deal with another day and to burden our children with a healthcare system that unfortunately they will probably not be able to afford. Mr. Speaker, it saddens me again to stand in my place and to know that the government still has not announced any sort of plan to deal with the lockout at Stora. The fact that they would announce a budget which does not even put forward a plan to deal with the lockout of 600 workers. Mr. Speaker, the Premier knows very well what impact this is having. I'm sure he hears it every day when he returns to his riding. No different for the member from Antigonish or the member from Inverness, for Guysborough Eastern Shore, who as well, along with other members, would know the impact that this lockout is having. Mr. Speaker, the thought that the government and the Premier would call an election while that mill is still under a lockout is just beyond my understanding. The workers at that mill cannot believe that the Premier is more focused on getting re-elected than he is on getting them back to work. But, Mr. Speaker, they will be given their opportunity, they will be given their chance. The people of Stora deserve better. The people of Nova Scotia deserve better. Our children deserve a better future. Mr. Speaker, the government has made it clear that they do not recognize these priorities. The NDP have made it clear that they're happy to be a one-issue party. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, it is time for renewal in this province. It's time for a better future, and it's time to give Nova Scotians the type of government that they deserve. And, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the election, and I look forward to our party being able to present a plan to Nova Scotians that will show them that there is a way to get a better future, and that way, Mr. Speaker, will be in electing a Liberal government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. The estimates then are referred to the Committee of the Whole House. I'll now recognize the Government House Leader.
Agreed.
Agreed? Agreed. I'll recognize the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move the House to now rise to meet again on the morrow at the hour of 9 a.m. The House will sit from 9 until 12, and the order of business following the daily routine will be public bills for second reading, and we will start at the top of the bill list on the orders of the day, Mr. Speaker, and proceed down as far as we can go. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, the motion is carried. Okay, we stand adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow. And order, please. I guess we've now reached the moment of interruption. And as indicated earlier, we have a resolution submitted by the member for Halifax Shabakdo, and I'll read the operative clause. Be it resolved that this government recognize medical residency as an education program for the purposes of student loan repayment. And I'll recognize the member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have an opportunity to speak on this very important issue. And if I have time in my 10 minutes, I may share that with the member for Sackville-Cobequid, our health critic, depending on... Oh, okay. So I wanted to take some opportunity to chat about this, Mr. Speaker, because this is an issue that we've raised in the House a bit today, because we think it's an important issue and one that affects healthcare in this province. We have a situation right now in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, where we have people in residency. They go through 4 years of undergraduate school, usually in a Bachelor of Science program, and let's face it, that's usually higher in tuition than a regular Bachelor of Arts or other programs. All the books, all the lab fees, all the money they have to put into that science program. Then they're lucky enough, they're one of the fortunate few that get into medical school. They go to medical school, and then that's another 4 years, usually at a very high rate of tuition. These people are coming out after 8 years of university with debts loads, in some cases of over $100,000, and we actually heard today, in some cases, closer to $200,000. Now, we all know as doctors, as people who do the residency, and some of these residencies, Mr. Speaker, can be for 3 or 4 years. First you do 2 years of residency in family medicine. Some of them do internships. Some of them end up doing residency in pediatric medicine. Some go on to orthopedic medicine. But, Mr. Speaker, the key point is that after they finish their 8 years of university and move on to residency, Mr. Speaker, these people are asked, they're considered people in the workforce. And as people in the workforce, it's required that they then start to pay back their loans. And in many cases, we all know that doctors can make a fair bit of money, Mr. Speaker, but they don't make it as residents. Residences are basically the grunt workers of the medical profession. They finished medical school. They're not full doctors who have the residency yet, and they're the ones who get very little pay by medical doctor standards, but are expected to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And as a result, Mr. Speaker, what we end up getting is doctors or medical students who go into residency who are told they have to start repaying massive loans, $200,000, $150,000 loans, and at the same time, it's supposed to be working on what would normally be considered an average salary for a professional, maybe in the $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 range. And of course, that's a lot of money by most standards in Nova Scotia. But for someone who has those kind of debts coming out of school, the encouragement then is to maybe go somewhere else where they can make more money, and then therefore they'll be able to pay down their debts. To be able to stay in Nova Scotia, to retain these Nova Scotians in many cases, or even others who've come to Dalhousie, who probably like Nova Scotia. They've enjoyed their time here. They want to stay here. But they can't, Mr. Speaker. They're not allowed to stay here because the system is set up such that they are forced to go somewhere else where they can make that extra money in residency so they can start to pay off their loans. Mr. Speaker, then we lose them in most cases forever. Maybe they go to Alberta. Maybe they go to the United States. Maybe they join Médecins Sans Frontières. I don't know, but the fact is they're not staying here in Nova Scotia. And as a result, we're losing those doctors that were educated here in our school, and they're going somewhere else. And Mr. Speaker, that's wrong. That is wrong, and the system clearly needs to be changed, and that is why we raised this issue today, and we think it's a very important issue, particularly with an election coming. It is vital that we begin to talk about how we can try and retain more doctors. We've talked about it as an immigration critic, Mr. Speaker. I've talked with immigrants in our province, people who want to come to this province. There's a guy in my area who runs a local store. He's from Syria, and he has a brother who's working in France as a doctor. He wants to come to Nova Scotia. He's having a hard time getting here. And Mr. Speaker, this is the issue, that we've created this CAP program in order to try and bring more doctors, foreign doctors here, to recognize their credentials, to encourage them to come here and set up practice. That is a good thing. But at the same time, I would argue it's a lot easier to retain a doctor who's finished medical school here and enjoys his province. It's a lot easier to do that by changing a policy that says those student loans do not have to be repaid until you finish your residency. When you finish residency and you become an orthopedic surgeon or a GP or a pediatric emergency room doctor, Mr. Speaker, and you start making 6 figures and more, then you'll have the money to be able to start paying down those loans. And that is when we should recognize that they become workers. Residency should be recognized as a schooling program, because that's really what it is. It's an apprenticeship. They're learning to be real, full doctors with full residency and privileges that come with that. And in that process, we should be saying, you're still in some form of schooling, you're in an apprenticeship program, we're not going to require you to have to pay, Mr. Speaker. That's what we should be doing. Unfortunately, that's not what we do. We talk about bringing doctors from other provinces. We talk about recruiting doctors from foreign countries, Mr. Speaker, yet we have young doctors who want to stay in Nova Scotia, but they're forced to leave because our system is set up to make it difficult for them because they start having to pay their loans. That is an issue, Mr. Speaker, that I think a lot of Nova Scotians would truly like to see changed. You know, I just think recently about down in the Southwest Nova area where they're trying to have a lottery because they can't find enough doctors. And they're having a lottery to see who will get to be a patient for the couple of doctors that are new to their area. A lottery. I mean, that's degrading. But this province could fix that if all we would do is change the policy to say that student loans accumulated while in medical school and undergrad do not have to be paid back until after a medical doctor has finished their residency. It's that simple. It's a change of policy. It's a change of legislation. It is not rocket science, Mr. Speaker. It's something that can be easily done that would make it a lot easier for these medical students entering residency to stay in this province. We've heard from the association, we've heard from individuals today who have specifically said that they think this can work, that it will encourage them to stay. They spoke out and said, please make this simple change and we can have a better system. And yet, Mr. Speaker, this government is more interested in getting re-elected than it is in actually fixing the problems that Nova Scotians have. Nova Scotians have a serious problem with a lack of medical attention. There are not enough doctors in this province, particularly in rural areas. We have enough trouble trying to retain and encourage and recruit people to come to rural Nova Scotia as doctors. And again, people who are based in Halifax might they understand this province. Maybe they're from here. Maybe they came from somewhere else to go to medical school here. There's an opportunity to keep them here in this province, to get them into River John, to get them into Barrington Passage, to get them into Inverness, Mr. Speaker. These places need doctors. Frankly, Halifax has a good number of doctors. We have a good number of specialists. But there are people out there that probably, if they lived here in Halifax, would understand the nature of these communities, may have fallen in love with this province, or maybe they even come from those communities. We can get them back into those communities. And all we have to do is change a simple policy that says that they don't have to pay their student loans back. They don't have to start making payments until after they finish their residency. These people are going to be making a lot of money. They're going to be making 6 figures more, plus, Mr. Speaker. They're going to have plenty of money to pay down their loans after residency. It's those first few years when they start to plant their feet, when they start to plant roots as to which community they're going to live the rest of their lives. That is where we need to capture them and say, you went to medical school here. Now you have an opportunity to stay here, and we're going to help you. Thank you for coming to Nova Scotia. Thank you, if you're from Nova Scotia, to go to medical school here. We want you to stay, and we're going to make it possible by addressing this what I consider an anomaly that says that residency is work. It is not a form of continuing education. And Mr. Speaker, I think that that is something we could do. Frankly, as a lawyer, I wish they would have done it for my articling fees. It would have made my life a lot easier. Unfortunately, people aren't knocking on doors demanding that we have more lawyers come to Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. So,
not to the legislature.
I digress. Well, we could get into the whole story about how many lawyers are in the legislature, Mr. Speaker, and frankly, you know. But the point is, Mr. Speaker, that, you know, we can talk about it for doctors. We should probably also be talking about it for nurses. You know, there might be an opportunity for nurses, actually, and now we have nurse practitioners, people talking about physician assistants. Mr. Speaker, maybe we can be looking at it with regard to laboratory technologists, others in the healthcare field as well, you know, that have to spend the first couple of years learning their trade in some form of either de facto or de jure apprenticeship, Mr. Speaker. And from that, it's important that we say to them, we want you to stay here. We want you to stay here, and we're not talking about waiving the loan or waiving tuition costs, though that is a debate we can have. For this, all we are saying is we're not going to require you to start paying on this loan while you're in some form of apprenticeship, because we feel it is important that you start to plant your roots here, and as a result, we can begin to build a system that will actually work for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. That's what we need. That's what we need in this province, is a system that Nova Scotians can feel confident that this government is doing everything it can to bring doctors and keep doctors in this province and keep healthcare workers in this province. We don't have that now. You know, again, if we have to have lotteries on the South Shore as to who gets a chance to visit a doctor on a regular basis, how is it possible for us to talk about primary medical care? How can we talk about reducing causes of chronic medical problems, whether it be obesity or whether it be diabetes, the increasing rate of diabetes, Mr. Speaker? These are issues that have to be dealt with by people visiting medical professionals on a regular basis, healthcare professionals, so they can get the advice they need to know that they can build the diet they need, that they can have the lifestyle they need. If they can't even get to see a doctor in this province, Mr. Speaker, how can we begin to talk to them about the primary health care needs they have to make their lives healthier, to make sure they live a long life, to make sure their children who are in that home also have an opportunity to live a long life? That is what we need, Mr. Speaker. That is what we don't have, and I wish we did. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I'll now recognize the Honourable Member from Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to rise today to participate in this evening's late debate, which was raised by the member from Timberley Prospect, and it reads, "Be it resolved that this government recognize medical residency as an education program for the purposes of student loan repayment." And Mr. Speaker, it's a great, shock to me really to realize that we are not doing that currently. I've read that, previous to this evening, but it's certainly the absolutely wrong thing to do. The students that are involved in residency after they've completed their studies at university are still paying a fee. They're paying something like $2,500 a year in tuition fees to the university while they're full-time residents. And I think in my mind that would be enough right there to verify and assure them of the status of a full-time student. They're earning salaries that are a lot less than they could earn if they chose to do their residency in another province, and that's very damaging as well in terms of retaining people here in our province. So when we have young students who've completed their medical school, I think we need to do whatever we can to shelter them from the burden of having to repay student loans and to have the interest begin to accumulate on those student loans, while in fact they have still not got enough training to fully occupy the profession that they are enrolled in and aiming for. And so I think that we need to look at this in a number of ways. First of all, as the previous speaker from Eastern Passage has said, that in fact this is a key priority area for all of us here in Nova Scotia. We need doctors, we need them particularly in the rural areas, but it is a priority in every community that we have enough doctors and specialists to take their place and serve the needs of the almost 1 million people that live in this province. And without them, Mr. Speaker, we are in a dire straits. And we also have an aging population putting ever-increasing demands on our medical system. And if we don't have the specialists and the family doctors who can help us, we're going to be in a very serious problem in the future. As has been said before, doctors are graduating now with really mortgage-sized debts. And I've talked to young people who feel that how can they possibly start their lives and save for their own children's university and contribute to their own children's savings funds when in fact they have enormous debt that they're paying off for years and years. And it's very difficult to get out from under that burden of debt so that they can start to even prepare for their own children and growing up and their needs. So we have to look at a way of at least sheltering them during the time that they're still studying. And these are young people who cannot really hold another job. Like so many students, they juggle their time in university with 2 or 3 part-time jobs in order to make ends meet. But in medical school, it's quite different. In the first 2 years, the students say it is possible to find some time to work part-time. But by the time you get into your final 2 years, you're doing clinical rotations, which make it really impossible between your classroom time and your time spent on these clinical rotations. It's really impossible. The quote I had read was that you'd have to be a miracle worker in order to fit in any part-time work at that stage. So that means their debts are even greater. If they're eligible, they're maximizing their student loan debt. They're taking on a lot of private debt in order to finance their way through this system. And tuition alone this year is over $13,000 at Dalhousie for a medical student. So it's one of the higher tuitions and very, very difficult to take that cost on. And bear in mind, that's only one part of the many costs they have to incur. because they have textbooks which cost an enormous amount of money, and they also have living costs. And you have to spend a lot to live here in the city. Anywhere in Halifax, it's much higher than other places. So there are huge costs. It's got to cost them well over I'd say $30,000 a year to attend university and do their medical studies. So when they're lucky enough to get a residency, and they're trying to pursue the final studies needed to take their place as a medical doctor, we shouldn't be immediately starting the clock ticking on their student loans and starting to ask for repayments at that time. That's just thoroughly unreasonable of the government to do so. And one of the points mentioned was that even at the time of getting residencies, the positions offered here in Nova Scotia pay much less than in comparable medical centres in other places in Canada. They said that in other places you can receive up to $80,000 a year for a residency, whereas here we have in a range of $40,000 to $50,000 for those residency positions. So we're not competitive in that regard to begin with. Then we're trying to as we give them a lower income, we're also trying to begin the repayment of the loans at the same time. And as I said, these young people have to be regarded as students until they are fully qualified to assume the role that they're being trained for. And you know, we want those specialists. We don't want to push them into other professions sooner. We need them to do these specialty studies. And some of them can last for years, Mr. Speaker. I had the figure of 7 years for surgical specialties, for example, before you're fully qualified. That's something very difficult for most of us to imagine in the fields that we've gone into. So they have made a huge contribution to our society. They're also making a huge personal I guess, commitment to forego other income for years and years while they study to assume these very important roles. So I think we have to look at that. And Mr. Speaker, the debt and the burden that these students are under causes so much pressure that often they don't even get to choose the area they might best want to go into. And there was one story I thought which is very telling, and I'm sure it's replayed over and over, but it was a student from rural Nova Scotia who wanted to become a doctor and actually preferred to be and had aimed to be a family doctor, wanting to return to rural Nova Scotia. And once she had gone through her first degree and so on, she realized that at that point her debt was so high that if she didn't choose a specialty, she would be paying it off forever and ever. And so it forces them not to go into family medicine, but to choose another specialty where their income will ultimately be greater, even though they have to invest a few more years. And so she instead really abandoned her dream of being a family doctor in a small town and went to take another specialty, ending up in a big city, leaving Nova Scotia, earning more money, but not realizing her dream of serving the people of Nova Scotia in the small town she came from. And what we're doing really through the burden of debt that the students are under and the system that we have in place, we're really forcing them to choose, you know, between serving as a family doctor and serving in specialty areas in other places. And that's driving them out of the province, Mr. Speaker. And I think that, as I say, that one woman's experience is not isolated. I think there are many others that face that same question, because the difference in income is really remarkable. You know, we might think a family doctor earns a good income, but they also pay a price with the lifestyle that they choose too, because they are accepting the fact that they have less family time and less time away from work. They're on call a great deal, especially in the rural areas. And when you look at all the factors, and then you compare that to some of the specialist positions that pay so much more, it drives them away. But Mr. Speaker, we're here today to really, you know, I guess appeal to the government to ask for a change in that ruling, that in fact the student loan rules should be altered immediately so that no longer are medical residents considered to be no longer students and be required to start their repayment of their student loans. I mean, as I've said, it's just unreasonable. It doesn't tie into our broader public policy, which is to make Nova Scotia a more attractive place for students to stay, for especially key areas where we know we have a shortage, where we need to encourage them to be here. You know, we can't just do business as usual when we have already identified some key policy areas that have to be addressed. And these are areas that if government doesn't tackle as a policy and a change in law, we're just going to continue to pay the price on the ground in our communities, whether you're here in the city, or you are living in one of the smaller towns and villages of Nova Scotia, we're having a tremendous difficulty retaining our doctors. So, Mr. Speaker, I feel that we have to look squarely at this. I think we have to do more in so many ways to address this need. But this is one very practical step that the students of Nova Scotia have brought to our attention and said, you can help us by making this very simple change. Stop considering us as no longer students once we are hitting our residency, and recognize that we are in a period of skills training and apprenticeship so that we get the extra sheltering until they graduate. And I think that's essential, and I'd call upon the government to do it as soon as possible, because this is hurting our retention of doctors in the province, which is essential that we get around that and do better, and it's also hurting young people every day here in the province of Nova Scotia. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much for your time, and I hope that the government will listen.
Thank you, honourable member. Seeing no other speakers on this issue, I would declare that the time for debate on the adjournment debate has expired, and the House will sit again tomorrow at 9 a.m.